Hello and a warm welcome to Quadriga. Our topic today is Europe in disarray. The EU was created to unite Europe after the war, but it has seldom looked so divided as in the past few months. First, the crisis over Britain's decision to leave the EU. And now the proposed trade deal between the European Union and Canada is on the verge of collapse. EU member states can't even agree on a common policy for dealing with a much more aggressive Russia. Short-term national or even regional interests take ever more precedence over the common European good. CETA, Brexit, and sanctions on Russia. Is it all over for the EU? That's our title today, and we've invited three renowned journalists to help us answer that question. It's a pleasure to welcome Ulrike Herrmann. She's a business editor at the Berlin daily newspaper, the Taz, and she says the EU will not break apart, neither over Brexit nor over the Canadian trade agreement, CETA. And it's a pleasure to welcome Malte Lemming. He's an opinion page editor at the Berlin daily Der Tagesspiegel. And he says even if an agreement on CETA can be reached, the EU is still experiencing its worst crisis ever. And finally, glad to have with us Andreas Kluth. He is the Germany correspondent for The Economist. He says 6 decades after its founding, all forces in the EU today are centrifugal. It's hard to be optimistic that in another 6 decades the Union will still exist as such. So pretty divergent opinions there in your opening statements. Ulrike Herrmann, clearly the optimist amongst you, versus two rather pessimistic assessments of where the EU's heading. Ulrike Herrmann, the pessimists would seem to be in good company. Both EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and the German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier have said that this represents an existential crisis for the European Union. Would you not agree with that?
Well, no. If look at CETA, I mean, it's supposed to be a trade agreement between Canada and the EU, but the trade flourishes anyway, even without this trade agreement. So even if CETA was not signed or not agreed upon among the parliaments in Europe, nothing would happen. The trade with Canada would flourish nonetheless. So you should not always think that once Europe is divided, that's the end of the EU or even the wealth in Europe.
Malte Lemming, yours was one of the more pessimistic voices, but this is hardly the first crisis that the EU has faced. 11 years ago, for example, the French and the Dutch rejected a proposed EU constitution. Wasn't that a graver crisis than the one we're seeing now over this Canadian trade deal? And in fact, the EU survived that just fine.
The crisis, and I would say the pessimist in this case is the well-informed realist. The crisis is not just a singular crisis. That was 11 years ago. We have multiple crises. We have the refugee crisis, a split in Europe about what to do with 1 million refugees. It's still unresolved. We have thousands of refugees still coming over the Mediterranean to the southern shores of Italy, and nobody really knows how to make a difference between migrants and refugees. We have the Ukrainian crisis. We have unresolved Greek debt crisis. It's still making bigger and bigger debts from term to term, and nobody knows what to do about it. So we have a number of crises that come together, and we have no clear will to reform these things. And I'm afraid that until next year, when 3 very, very important elections have taken place in Germany, in the Netherlands, and France, 3 member states of the EU that are at the core of the EU, and from the outcome, it's very much how the reform of process in the EU will go on.
Andreas Kluth, you say centrifugal forces prevail, but in fact, in recent years, there have been changes toward greater integration on monetary policy and also even on fiscal policy. We've got European Banking Union up and running. We've got a fiscal compact that give Brussels at least some oversight over national budgets. In the end, isn't it a zigzag course? And is that so surprising? If you look, you're an American, if you look at how long it took the U.S. to get integration of all of those colonies and later states. Isn't that surprising to see that the EU also has a bumpy course?
Well, the U.S., we could get sidetracked on that historical comparison, but between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitutional Convention, there was over a decade, but then it figured out under Alexander Hamilton how to get these then 13 states into a proper union. And from then on, it went uphill.
No, then
We've
you
been
had
at
a
it for
civil war again in order to solve
and
the
that
rest.
that is another argument, I mean, that would support a pessimistic course. But I'm saying the Union as such has held. But in the case of the EU, what you see, and I'm with Malte on this point, I must say, is the accumulation of the crisis. I'm not pessimistic on the EU because of CETA. CETA is economically not the end of the world. It's not huge. I do think CETA is an important symbol and has an important political meaning in that on all these other issues, the EU has the refugee crisis, Ukraine and so forth, been demonstrating to EU citizens themselves who are losing interest that it can no longer solve any problems, anything big. But at least until now, the EU had one thing, a sort of superhero power, like Batman and stuff, and it was trade policy. The original raison d'etre of the EU was we 28 together can face the America and China, these giants in world trade, and get good trade deals done. And now, for the past year or so, we've been demonstrating that we in the EU, that the EU is is prone to hysteria over these trade deals, especially the Germans and Austrians, because CETA is really a warm-up for the American trade deal, TTIP. And now we're seeing that the Germans first, and now one region of one small member state, Belgium, can keep throwing up question marks over these deals. And if you're elsewhere in the world, whether it's Canada or China, you're saying these people are not seriously. We have to have other plans. The EU cannot be taken seriously. So we've basically shown that even in our superpower is not the superpower of the EU. The core competence was trade deals. And even there, the EU cannot come together. And that is what makes me pessimistic, that the EU will come together on any other serious problem.
Let me come back to the trade issue in just a moment, but one more question about that broader picture. Malte Leeming listed a number of the areas where there has been resistance beyond trade. The fact that the Eastern European so-called Visegrad countries have refused to take in their share of refugees. Or we're currently seeing Italy saying that it might block next year's EU budget because it wants more leeway on its own deficit spending. And then we also have the British voting to leave altogether. Ulrike Herrmann, what's with the great disaffection in the EU? Why does it have such a bad rap? Does it really do nothing for its citizens?
No, I think that the basic problem is that usually you have a decision taken by all 28 member states. It's usually a compromise taken in Brussels by all governments. And then they go home to their national countries and tell their people, well, that was Brussels that decided on this and this issue. And they never, ever mentioned that they themselves had agreed on this compromise. And of course, this kind of political rhetoric, which was very convenient for the national governments, of course now makes people feel that this faraway Brussels is dominating their own politics, which is not true, but which is an impression that the national governments fostered themselves. And now this is costing a price. And of course, Europe only has a possibility to survive if this rhetoric is being changed.
Interestingly enough,
I don't believe it's just a question of rhetoric. I believe it's more or less a question of we have two principles are putting in doubt right now. The first one is we have too many decisions that are requiring unanimous decisions from all European member state countries. Too many of them. We should have more democratic elements, and it's the majority rules. This means we have to change a lot of contracts. I know this quite well.
That would mean that Germany rules, you know. I can understand that the others don't want that.
I understand that too, but that's the question of majorities in Europe.
Yeah, but
if
that's
you have
really
80 million Germans and they try to to play by the rules, and you have, let's say, 3 million other people who are not playing by the rules and don't have to be afraid of sanctions, then we have a serious problem in Europe. So that would be the next second principle: is we need a more effective sanction system. We don't have any sanction. Like you just mentioned, the Italians. Matteo Renzi is saying yes, the interest of the Italian people are much more interest me than the technocrats in Brussels. So what is that for kind of a quote? This shows, for example, and he doesn't have to be afraid from any kind of sanctions.
You know why? Because if we applied sanctions to Italy, Italy would be forced to leave the euro. So, you know, if the others agree on Italy having these large deficits, it's because they want, and that's in Germany's interest, they want to save the Eurozone. So, you know, it's not only about sanctions. Europe is really a very complex system because the countries are so different. And of course, that's very difficult to explain to the voters. But I think that just having sanctions wouldn't solve anything. That's all I want to say, because...
economic sanctions in this case.
Yeah,
Let's underline the fact that we're talking...
But you've just made our point, which by pointing us to the complexity of the system, which A, Europeans don't understand, therefore they don't like it if you don't understand it, and B, the complexity of the system means we cannot solve very big issues. And there it is. Not one little reform, one little tweak will change it.
Interestingly enough, Ulrike Herrmann said a moment ago that Brussels seems so far away to so many member states. But in fact, the region that essentially stopped the Canadian trade agreement dead in its tracks is not at all far away from Brussels.
Well, that's true.
It is a small region of Belgium known as Wallonia, where there are pretty much more cows than people. Let's take a closer look at what happened to that Canadian trade agreement.
The mood in Brussels is somber. The EU has been plunged into yet another crisis, this time over the CETA trade agreement. Canada's Minister of International Trade, Chrystia Freeland, says she's tired and frustrated.
It's
evident to me and to Canada, as though Europe is not capable of reaching an international agreement.
But many in Europe say that the Wallonians should stand up for their rights. There have been huge demonstrations across the continent against these international trade agreements. Many complain that the treaties are negotiated in secret and will likely favor the interests of big business over those of consumers. Does the CETA dispute signal a new low in relations between the EU and average European citizens?
I was wrong about the cows and the humans. Andreas Kluth, the economist, pointed out this week that, in fact, Wallonia boasts 1 cow for every 3 humans. It has lavishly subsidized farmers, this particular region, and they apparently feared Canadian competition. Is that legitimate reason to block a trade deal that apparently would have made Europe 6 billion euros richer per year?
You get this sort of opposition to trade deals whenever you negotiate a trade deal. You're getting it in America, both against the American-European trade deal and against the American-Asian trade deal. And of course, any negotiation balances these differences out. But we had, I think, a good working model before in the EU, where the EU would negotiate on behalf of everyone and decide to get the best deal for everyone. They have a right to go on the streets, and they have a right to vote, and that is in free speech. But we are, at The Economist, we have observed this year what I believe is a tone of hysteria that actually largely has started from the German-speaking parts of Europe, Austria and Germany, where one fear after another was, I believe, hyped up. Out of very complex details. A narrative was constructed first that the Americans or Canadians would bring in poorer standards, especially in food. Then that was replaced by another fear, and most recently by this narrative that these deals are just good for good corporations, which I think is also an oversimplification. And so now they're, of course, afraid in Belgium for agricultural competition. So this is exactly an example for what we see as a trend that affects the entire West, from Australia to Trump supporters to Brexit supporters, from Hungary to what we call it a reaction against globalization between people who want to pull the drawbridge up and people who want to lower it down, people who want to stay open to the world, who want to close off. And that is the battle line, the fault line that we see in the entire West. And we have to sway this debate so that the right side wins.
And Ulrike Herrmann, those who would like to keep trade flowing in the end, of course, are those who benefit. I mentioned that figure, 6 billion euros a year, supposedly in benefits to the EU as a whole, that this treaty is worth. The fact is, neither the EU nor many other places are doing a very good job of redistribution of those to those who are hurt by trade.
Yeah,
Isn't
anyway,
that correct?
6 billion, it sounds a lot. It's just nothing. Because, you know, Germany alone has a GDP of 3 trillion. So, and this is 6 billion for the whole of the EU. That's just nothing. You cannot even express that in percentages. This means that, that's no wonder, because, as I said, the trade is already flourishing between Canada and the EU, and this trade agreement will not alter anything. So the really interesting question is, why do you need a trade agreement if there is already trade flourishing? And the point is, it's all about lobbyism. And Mr. Kloot said, well, all these critics, they are just hysterics. No. Because these ISDS, the investor dispute settlement,
arbitration,
the arbitration between states and transnational firms is really a big problem. Because in fact, you have then a second possibility for transnational big firms to go to court and to get a lot of money out of the states or the governments. And that is not just a fear that's not grounded, but that's the experience we have with NAFTA and with something in
with the North American
trade agreement.
Association.
Yeah, and we have the same thing for the energy sector here in the EU. And we saw big national firms getting a lot of money from different governments. And so that's something people do not want to see again. And that's basically the main point the Belgians make. It's not about agrarian stuff, it's about these international settlement dispute regime.
So, Malte Lemming, it sounds like we're hearing from Ulrike Herrmann, look, this is a proper exercise of democracy, and if necessary, this trade agreement can be reconfigured. What do you say to that?
That's the problem. It is a proper example of democracy, but the democracy Belgium style. I mean, that each of these regions need to support the agreement, which was agreed upon from 28 member states over 7 years, shows that's not democracy. I mean, this is if we, for example, if we as Germany will send troops abroad somewhere, and it needs to be supported by every 16 Länder in Germany instead of the parliament, the federal parliament. It would be terrible. We would never send troops somewhere because they will always find a socialist governed state that will say no to it. So it's the lack of democracy and of proper execution of democracy that led to the Wallonians saying no to that. I mean, all these details that the farmer would pay things and things. You can find compensation agreements for that. You can say let's have a year of we tried for a year and then we see if you have made a bad fortune out of it, and so on and so on. Every kind of these problems are solvable. It's a reflection of the European sentiments against globalization, against capitalism, what's so called, and it's a reflection of this that especially in Germany and Austria, these sentiments were growing so high.
Let me take us to another aspect that's causing people to wonder to what degree the EU is still, in a sense, governable. There were cries after the Canadian trade deal was rejected by the Wallonians that globalization is dead. And the former NATO Secretary General Javier Solana went even further and said that he believes the rejection of CETA amounts to a death knell for internationalism in general. He warns that Russia could profit from the current wave of Euroscepticism. Let's take a look at this week's EU equivocation on sanctions if Russian atrocities in Aleppo continue.
Russia has been criticized sharply for its support of the Syrian military, particularly airstrikes that have targeted Aleppo. During the 5 years of the Syrian civil war, more than 400,000 people have been killed. At an EU summit in Brussels last week, the member states could not agree on whether to impose immediate sanctions on Russia for its airstrikes on Aleppo. The trouble with current European foreign policy is that we have no consensus. That makes things easier for the Russians. And in eastern Ukraine, Russian-backed separatists continue to shell government troop positions in violation of last year's Minsk agreement. Will the European Union, with its 28 member states, ever be able to agree on a common foreign policy?
Andreas Kludt, we all know that famous, rather disparaging sentence that was uttered by Henry Kissinger when he was Secretary of State in the U.S. He said, "Europe, who do I call if I want to talk to Europe?" Is Europe a reliable partner in an increasingly turbulent world?
A reliable partner, you mean for America, for instance? Well, we just watched this introduction about the Russian situation, and you said, leading into that Vladimir Putin is the primary beneficiary of this European disunity that we're discussing here. And that is absolutely true, and it is very tragic. Because Vladimir Putin has been observing this trend of centrifugal forces in Europe for years now, and he's exploiting it. We know that with his strategy is to aim his propaganda at dividing the EU member states from one another and to divide within each member state the public opinion. Germany is among the countries that he has targeted. And there was recently a very notorious, spectacular case about a made-up rape allegations that was trumped up of a Russian-German girl that was trumped up to the highest level in Russia and became a diplomatic incident. The German spy services, the BND, are now investigating this Russian propaganda and interference in the German democratic process, if you will. We know that he's even interfered in the American democratic process this year and elsewhere. So his strategy is to split Europe as best he can. And this should be a wake-up call, that there are much greater things at stake than, I agree, than CETA, than the Canadian trade deal. But really, that if we don't find common ground on how to deal with bullies in our neighborhood, then it's curtains.
Ulrike Herrmann, the EU's three biggest countries actually only wanted to warn Russia that individuals and organizations that in some way were connected with the bombing of Aleppo might face sanctions. That hardly seems like a drastic measure. How is it possible that EU member states couldn't agree on that?
Well, I think, we already had sanctions on Russia because of the conflict in the Ukraine, and they didn't really work very well. So the question is, anyway, do sanctions really help? I mean, that was the same question when we had sanctions with Iran. It didn't really help either. So, and then the basic question is also, of course, many European countries really have their own interests. They want, of course, to export into Russia and to make money. But the basic question is, anyway, is it really a good idea to weaken Russia economically? Because they are very weak anyway, because of the sinking oil price. And that's the largest export commodity, oil. And what you can see is once that the oil price went down, Putin became more and more aggressive because the weakening economic situation in Russia forces him to be aggressive outside in order to stabilize his power. So if we start weakening him on top of the sinking oil price, it might be backfiring. It is not really a good idea. But apart from that, I agree that Europe is divided anyway on the question of how sanctions would affect themselves economically.
Malte Lemming, what do you think will be the impact of Brexit when the UK is eventually out of the European Union? Does that make a common foreign policy and security policy even less easy to reach?
Yes, yes. No, I believe very much so that the core strength of the European Union is trade, is fiscal and economic unity. It is not foreign policy. They not even have the military to try to
they
implement.
Have NATO. It's called NATO.
NATO is something different than the European Union.
Yeah.
I believe very much in NATO, but NATO is different. I mean, the United States is not part of the European Union.
Okay, yeah.
That makes the biggest difference of all. So I believe very much in NATO being a strong foreign policy and military force, and I don't believe in the European Union being that. So maybe Kissinger should call Putin directly and not try to find anyone in the European Union to talk to about how to solve problems. So that might be the easiest and more direct way to do it.
Let me ask all three of you. Our title, as you know, is CETA, the Canadian Trade Agreement, Brexit, sanctions on Russia. Is it all over for the EU? Let's look ahead for 5 years and maybe for 20 years. Brief answer, if you would, please, from all three of you. Where will the EU be then? Will it still exist, and will it be in a different form than now? Andreas Kludt.
Neither CETA nor Brexit will break the EU in the coming few years. But I think that after 6 decades of a very curvy path towards more integration, with big setbacks, but towards more integration, we have reached a turning point and we're going in the other direction. And in the coming decades, you will see the energy going out of the European project until it becomes irrelevant and possibly disappears.
The EU will survive for the simple reason that economically, Europe is united since the Roman times for the last 2,000 years.
We have strong anti-globalist, anti-European forces, Trump, the far right and the far left. If they become stronger in the next years, it will be very hard for Europe to survive. And we will all look to the American election, Netherlands, France and German election. Then we know for sure if Europe can be safe or not.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us, and thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.